In our last episode, we were talking about application of blockchain technology in international trade, supply chain management, and food traceability. And it was a bit technical discussion. So we promised to have the second episode that will speak about basics of the blockchain technology. And to help with this, I have two great partners, Professor Lee and Karen, joining me today. And I'll leave introduction to them. So could you please provide more info about what you're doing at the moment? What are your projects?
First of all, I'd like to thank Armen for inviting me here to share some of my research. I'm a professor at the Singapore University of Social Sciences, and my research area is in inclusive fintech. I also invest in inclusive fintech projects, working on those projects that serve the underserved, especially in self-sovereign identity, as well as tokenization of livestock, as well as the supply chain. And I also try to write as many articles as possible to disseminate the research and the information, especially those that I find interesting and where there's a gap in the industry and also the academic research as well as the project level.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Karen, would you like to speak more about what you're doing at the moment?
So part of my time is at Kommerce, which is a trade finance project in financing food shipments to sub-Saharan Africa. Food there, because of the lack of finance that we take for granted in the rest of the world, costs anywhere from 50 to 300% more than it would leaving the factory here. And access to calories is really important. Part of the reason why we use blockchain is we looked at how the lack of information and the lack of trust actually creates market failure and higher prices. Since COVID has made travel and the ability to sign up new merchants difficult because we have an international trade project, my COVID job has been delivering groceries, working in dealing with wholesalers to deliver produce directly to consumers in a time when supermarkets are crowded and you don't get delivery slots, as well as, there have been some food shortages because the supermarket supply chains are not built to deal with 2 or 3 times the normal number of consumers in market.
Thank you. It's going to be an interesting discussion because last time we missed that point about the financial accessibility and how blockchain technology really makes finance accessible, not only for also for the SMEs, which is a really challenge that we're facing at the moment. And I'd like to start our discussion with a definition of the blockchain that I could have kind of received from the Vitalik Buterin's interview. And he says that blockchain system can be observed as a virtual computer created by a bunch of nodes and the network. And those nodes in the network periodically publish blocks. Block is a list of transactions together with a hash and a previous block that is built on top, and you have this chain of them. Mm-hmm. It seems that you're smiling, you fully understand the technology, but when just a person with no background in this technology really think about blockchain, this definition is very technical for them. So the first thing I'd like to do is, Professor Lee, maybe starting with you, because obviously every day you're teaching students about blockchain technology, its application, but also speaking in many events when you need to be a very, I would say, straightforward about explaining the technology. Because for us, it's so important. So people and audience understand the technologies because only then they can think about its applicability. So what would be your simple way of defining blockchain?
I don't think there's a very simple way to define blockchain, but I will try to use some examples so that we could understand it. So if you think of blockchain as a trust machine in the virtual space or in the open sea, where there's memory of all the things that you have done, so that in some ways it's almost immutable in the sense that you will have to use a lot of computation power to change whatever that has been recorded or the memory. Then you build out a trust without a third party. And that trust is actually safeguarded by a whole community. So the way to think of it is that you can think of blockchain as a form of decentralization online, where the trust is distributed, and in the process, when we are dealing with transfer of value through a ledger, okay, then there is a very important function. That value can incentivize the malicious element not to act in a particular way, or we can incentivize the entire ecosystem to act in a way that we can have a very good outcome.
To speak simply, that's a journal where you write something and you can never delete it, because you mentioned trust, and trust comes from that community that kind of validate that transactions. And then you mentioned also, other than trust, memory, right? So it's a good memory that you can never delete. Can we say that it's just a journal of different records that you can never delete?
It will be very expensive to change it. And you want to change it, I think you have to have consensus or agreement with many parties, and you usually involve a lot of computing power to do that. The longer you go back in history that you want to change, the more computing power that you will need. And the more people you have, then you too will have to ensure that you have huge computation power to be able to control the entire network to reduce your cost of changing the history.
And so the trust is born from the fact that you can't change it. So people can believe that whatever is in that journal, whatever, is it a register, is it a healthcare system, trade system, or whatever, the trust born just because there is no centralized agency managing that. Is that right?
Yes, I think the different degree of trust, you have a third-party trust centralized. And what we are trying to do here in the blockchain is to distribute the trust across a lot of people with different geographical area, with different, hopefully, in besides different location, different people with different authority or power. Because when you are centralized and you are not able to function independently, then the resources and the cost to change that history is a lot less than if you have a lot of people who are functioning independently, even in geographically distributed. That is even more important.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights.
I hope it give you a very
I think as we go into the some terminology behind blockchain, so our audience have better understanding of the technology behind that. And I have two more questions, very generic in its nature, before we're going into the more trade-related issues and topics. The types of the blockchains, or maybe that's not the right framing of the question, but there are many companies like IBM is using the Hyperledger technology in their food traceability project. And there is Ethereum, right?
Yep.
And there is more generic term that people knows as a blockchain. How would you differentiate between them?
I'd start with who is allowed to use the blockchain. Everybody is allowed to use it. You would need higher security settings to make sure that information on the blockchain is not compromised. And information compromise is something that, have you guys ever backed up a hard disk drive before cloud?
Yeah.
So the question is always, how many hard disks do you need to make sure that your information is safe?
Very simple example for our audience. For example, I have a contract.
Yep.
And I want to ensure that this contract is kept by as many people as possible, even anonymous people.
Yep.
So just in case something happens with my contract, there is another copy backed up.
Yes.
And then as number of these anonymous increases, say I send it to millions of people and millions of people keep it on their hard drive, that's basically what we call decentralization. And those that keep that information is very simply, those are the so-called nodes that keeps that information. If I need to verify, if there's someone else comes to me and say that, I don't trust your contract, I can say, there is million others that you can go. And actually, in this case, if it's an anonymous, you can go. But let's speak that it's not anonymous.
Yep.
So you can go and ask person A, could you please open your computer? You open the computer, you see the exactly same contract, and you say, okay, this is the right contract.
Practically speaking, the easiest to understand is that I want to start doing blockchain. So you start with, I use the cloud. I use my own computer to store the information. And before that, I use the filing system. But the problem with the filing system that anyone can change it. My staff can come in and change it. So I put it on the computer, I have the password. So therefore, I have a key to open my cabinet. Now I have password. So I have another layer of protection. But the problem is that once you're linked to the internet, the malicious element can come in and take away and change whatever in there if you don't have the cyber hygiene that you have. So how do we improve the security of that and more trust in the data that we are stored? So then you can say, why don't we use a private blockchain? I have a few more parties to ascertain that not only I'm protecting the integrity of the data in this office, but now other offices are also helping me to do a surveillance on my office so that we have 3 or 4 offices looking at each other to make sure that the data has got more integrity. Then the question is that you expand this further and further, then you reach open blockchain, because at the end of the day, then the whole world will have no doubt, because how many people is enough to call it, the cost is high enough to change the data itself. So that is what it is. The more people, and the people do not collude among them. So the question is that you need to, when in your design thinking throughout, you look at this, is that how you need to have a balance, right? Practically, how many nodes I have, right? Whether private or public blockchain, whether it's a combination of private or public blockchain, will be enough for our comfort to say that this data is trustable enough.
Now, just one more addition before I really want to kind of jump into the relating now our conversation to trade.
Mm-hmm.
And one more question would be about, so nodes could be, in terms of the decentralized blockchain, minor,
yep,
or in terms of the centralized, or not the centralized, but permissioned blockchain, private blockchain,
yep,
it could be human, right?
It could be human, somebody you trust, like
Okay.
a shipping agent or SGS or Veritas, somebody who is paid by the transaction to actually say that this container has 27 tons, these are the specs that it fits, and I certify it conforms.
Let me now switch to your core business in the first place. And you said that your business is really focusing on improving the accessibility of the trade financing,
Yes.
right? How do you do that with a blockchain?
So, trade finance in sub-Saharan Africa and developmental economics is it's an old economics problem. You're economists and you teach, so you know the lemon market problem, where
Yeah.
you have insufficient information you can't trust. Therefore, all the good actors get charged more, all the bad actors scam, and eventually the market shrinks and fails. And you see that in markets for loan sharks. That's why loan sharks charge so much, because they can't distinguish good risk from bad. If you have a good market with credit ratings, you can distinguish good risk from bad, and everybody can be tiered with the appropriate level of risk, instead of everybody being charged the same extortionate interest rates. But that's an example of how information. Now, when you have trade, there's a lot of information that you need to determine risk, and that risk then determines your lending profile. But because all that information is only in the heads of the people dealing with that, it becomes very easy for them to scam people until they exit, and then new people come in. So that cheating happens across a lot of agricultural commodities.
My impression is that you improve the accessibility by having a lot of data and analyzing that data. So what's the value of the blockchain?
So the value of the blockchain in our case, right, is that banks are actually not incentivized, if you have a good client who pays on time, to actually give them a lower interest rate, because I can take 35% from you. But the net effect is that end consumers in the developing world suffer because they are paying for that much higher cost of finance. Their calories cost more. If you can find good borrowers and lend to them at an intermediate between the developed world rate as well as what they're paying, everybody wins. We split the difference with them. And over time, if you build a history for them, maybe you could lend to them at what the commodities houses are getting it at.
So basically, the value would be that you're minimizing all type of the fraud in the system,
Yes.
so the banks and financial institutions can trust that information.
Yes.
So on one hand, it's information. On the second, how you basically store that information.
Yes.
And that creates the trust between all stakeholders in the system. And that's what your solution is.
That's
Fair
essentially
enough.
what our solution is.
Professor Lee, so now I'd like to go back to the work that we're actually doing in jointly on the food traceability, because in our previous episode, we spoke about that, but how would you explain the food traceability? What are the benefits of adopting, I would say, public blockchain for food traceability? Because, and let's speak in a way that it's a blockchain 101 for the food traceability. How would you explain that?
Well, I think traceability using the blockchain is very important in the sense that it will give a sense of confidence in the transparency of the data. In the supply chain, there is no level playing field, and therefore there's not enough information, and therefore the pricing power is very distorted. And it is important to have that because when there's any dispute, the cost of recovering the information may be high or low, but the cost of retrieving the trusted information, if it's low, then there is a lot of incentive for people to ensure that they act in a way that is good for the entire ecosystem. And that means...
So, Professor Lee, does that mean that the blockchain resolves the very big issue of the transparency? So what it basically provides as a value for the traceability is the transparency.
Yes, I think that is very important in the sense that when the goods or the products or the farm products that leave, you need to have a sense of how that is being handled. And if the data can be trusted and if there's any dispute, so that those are the important process that we have to go through to ensure that there is enough transparency there. And blockchain has the advantage of the recovery of information. The cost is fairly low, especially on a public blockchain.
Yes.
So that type of evidence that you can produce with low cost will ensure that everyone will try to abide by what they have promised to do. And this is important for reducing food wastage. This is important to ensure there's more level playing field for pricing decision. This is important because if you can digitize the goods, especially farm products or perishable goods, then you actually will have transparency to the insurance company, and therefore the risk for the insurance company is lower, and therefore you may end up paying a lower insurance charges. And also in terms of lending, and you create that comes hand in hand is your own behavior that give you a good rating, then banks are likely to extend more favorable terms in terms of for your LCs, for
So it's
financing.
also about efficiency of the international trade, because obviously this system will bring about a better production practices just because of the transparency of the info. It will bring to a better food safety situation, obviously from the government perspective. And in our previous episode, we actually covered most of the things, but one challenge that was mentioned by one of our guests, and I want to hear your take on that as well, is that the system is not yet capable. The blockchain, in terms of the speed of operation, in terms of the even the cost of the public blockchain, we still are not there. In other words, the blockchain, if we decide scale it up to the full traceability of all product in the world, imagine that everyone agrees on that, then there is not enough capacity. In other words, the trade now is so complex and fast that this technology wouldn't solve the issue. What would be your take? And maybe we can start with Karen, Professor Lee, just because she's is engaged in the trade very much, and then we'll hear your take on that as well.
I think that those problems are being solved, and we have some of the brightest minds in the world working on solving it. The biggest problem that actually has not been solved is the privacy issue, but that's also an exciting time where we have zero knowledge proofs, we have range proofs where you can put that information in, but only a select few have the encryption key to take that information out. Now that's exciting because you make it possible to put in the entire private information on a transaction between two parties on a blockchain in a way that's trustable but still private. So you can see basic information about was it a good transaction, was it not bad transaction, but you don't have information about what actually went on, and that information is private only between the two parties because this price information is actually quite sensitive. If I'm doing a large bulk shipment of grain, it could change grain prices in those markets.
Okay, got that. But I think there is, in my opinion, there is a way of solving that issue. But right in the beginning, you mentioned that, yes, speed and cost is a limitation factor, but bright people are working on that.
Yes.
In other words, may I interpret that they are still working? In other words, the system is not ready yet, Professor Lee.
Let me put it this way, that there's some merit in that argument. But if you look at blockchain, is just a few blockchain that people will adopt and use it. So there are many, many blockchains out there. If you look at what China is doing, BSN, blockchain-based service network, they have 8 open blockchain and they're working with a lot of private blockchain that is in the space. If you cast your mind to an open field of thinking as every blockchain is a node, then you don't have that view that blockchain cannot solve the problem whether it's open or private. But you have to think about interoperability,
Yes.
which I mentioned all this time. Think about second layer, multi-layer as well, because the second layer, there are many techniques to speed up the transaction per second. There are many techniques to link up,
Yep.
and there are no doubt they're working on it, but the blockchain time, 1 year is about 20 years in the physical time in my
Yes, it
space,
is,
because
it is.
the way they progress is very fast. And when the government are involved, for example, UNDP is involved, an international organization is involved, and they start funding digital infrastructure.
Yes.
Because this is actually digital infrastructure.
Can you articulate what do you mean by digital infrastructure?
Standards and basics.
Is
bills
it
of lading?
5G is the digital infrastructure?
It's part of it. I think a lot of us think that infrastructure is something hard, but now we need to think of infrastructure as everyone which is entitled to in order to get on life as normal. They are all there's a basic so-called human needs that we have.
Mhm.
So 5G is one, but 5G is the gold standard. There are mesh network, there are other technology they're using.
Professor Lee, I want to be a very kind of a practical. And imagine we have some country office watching this video
Yep.
and thinking about, yes, I want to pilot this technology. I want to go to the government representative. And actually, we have that demand.
Yep.
But those government representatives at first want to understand the value, and we covered it well.
Yes.
And then they want to understand where we should start. So one thing, as you mentioned, is this digital infrastructure. So my take would be,
Yes.
please, can you bring an example of what it means, digital infrastructure? Because our colleagues may think about investing in that. And if you can also speak about the cost of that infrastructure, that would be very valuable. And then, other than that, as I understood, digital infrastructure, what is next? What government needs to know? Where government needs to invest?
I think portable ID is important, which is, I think, Kommerce is looking into that as well. You can see other governments are also looking into ID, and digital ID. But I think why I raise all this is because blockchain could also decentralize communication through the mesh network. They could also have the so-called self-sovereign identity, which I like to call it as portable ID, because I can ID that the whole world will have trust in this ID rather than from a particular country. So they can link up together, but it doesn't prevent me from...
So it means some kind of a global identification system for individuals. So I don't need my passport anymore because there is my digital ID that I carry in my gadget or even don't carry anywhere. maybe it's my face recognition that provides data that I have this education, this diploma, I was born in this particular place, etc., etc. So it's all information in one place, and you don't need this kind of a documents anymore.
So we are into a tokenized world. So this is what blockchain is bringing to us, to a token economy. It's more than a digital economy. It's more than a sharing economy. A token economy is a lot wider than what we know now, and it will introduce a lot of new business model. It will introduce a lot of new customers, because a lot of people were excluded unless we have we tokenize the connectivity services, so that everybody can be an entrepreneur having a mesh box, and I own it, you can store it, and there's privacy protection, and I have everybody has your own tokenized identity, which is a portable identity. Then all the goods and services are tokenized on the supply chain, and then we can reduce the friction and more transparency, and those people who are included and the goods who are included will come back into the economy, because there are just too many people who are excluded.
Professor Lee, in this case, just one issue with the data privacy. In this case, if you're speaking about digital ID, and that all information is basically collected about that particular individual, does it mean that we really sacrifice our privacy for more efficient economy and better services?
I do look at it that way. I can tell you that even you don't carry any digital devices, the satellite can pinpoint.
So in other words, you mean that we anyway sacrifice our democracy, our privacy?
Whichever way we are, the privacy is already gone in the digital world with satellite.
So you consider that by default we lost our privacy.
And the question now is, how do we protect whatever we are left behind? So we need to use the blockchain to ensure that data privacy is as much as possible protected, or we at least delay the kind of fear that we have.
Is it true to say that actually blockchain help us to protect our privacy?
Yeah. So at least to some extent, because I don't think we can do it totally, because whatever it is if there's enough resources in trying to monitor, you will be monitored, right? We may not have any secret, but we need to have privacy.
So I'm just going to jump in with how zero knowledge proofs would function, which is you don't actually need to give the person your entire information. You carry your ID to a bar. They know your name, they know your picture, and they do that just to see if you're age over 21. What you could theoretically do with a digital ID is go to a bar, scan the QR code, and then it just returns the information that you're above 21 and that your face matches. You don't have to give them your ID, your address, divulge that. So a blockchain-based system with robust privacy and encryption could do that. So for example, you shouldn't have to show anybody your bank statement. All they want to know is, are you a good risk, or do you have a certain threshold of income or assets? So you should be able to say, this is my face, this is one biometric, not all of them, and this is the proof that I have above a threshold of income to conduct this transaction, for example, buy a house or buy a car.
And who's going to pay for that?
So when you have these systems with zero knowledge proofs and that system, it all depends on how you design the system. Is it the government has the first basic building block, and that every transaction, the person who wants to access that transaction then pays for that because they are making money off you? That's possible. Or is it that you can decide that you want to share the cost of accessing that information because it is something that you guys, for example, are doing? But with a token system, and this is what we're referring to with smart contracts, it then becomes possible for people to design and enforce that without human intervention.
So I think the on-chain governance is such that with the token, the marginal cost or scalability, margin for scaling is almost close to zero.
Yes.
So as the scale is basically going up, then the marginal cost is going down, right?
Basically, whoever want to participate as a node, you use your own electricity, you use your own equipment. So the government just need to have the infrastructure up, and then the businesses will then build on top, and the retail can then actually participate using their own resources.
Yes.
So
Okay, let's go back So we had the connectivity, we had the digital ID. What else?
Which
you
is the
mean under
blockchain
the-
system which we are
Yes,
talking about. And
So what government needs to do for the blockchain system?
I think the governments actually need to sit together and have an equivalent of an internet engineering task force. It's been done before and it's still done. The internet is governed by the IETF, which is open source. I think we need to sit down and decide how each society is going to have a blockchain for itself and what aims they want to
Does
achieve.
it mean that they need to put together a regulation for that? Because government is a
we
policymaker,
haven't
right?
reached that stage yet. I think first we start off with the standards and then see what happens. I think this is what China is doing at this moment.
Yes.
With BSN, they have the smart cities by all the private blockchain, and then they have 8 open blockchain to globally to the rest of the world. And then they have ITU that look into the standards.
Yes.
So they are really having a standard being set up, but the rest of the government are still waiting and seeing. And Singapore is part of the movement of doing that. Hong Kong, Thailand, a lot of countries in Asia, they have really looking into how to build this digital infrastructure to ensure that people who are excluded can be brought back. Because once you empower them with connectivity, once you empower them with identity, then they can go on to the private and public blockchain, and then they will be able to do a lot more in the virtual world. And then when that virtual world is linked up with the physical world with IoT, a lot of data will be collected, and that again will improve the credibility of the SMEs, because SMEs are not able to, in some ways, without any history, they can't have enough credibility to lower the access to cheaper capital, cheaper insurance, and so on.
Do we need to have a local standards or international standards, or it's a time to really sit together and have the global standard for these kind of things?
Every country has to start on their own.
Yes.
That's how they start. And after a while, it's inevitable they will come together and say that how do we do interoperability? It's already happened, right? Thailand and HKMA in Hong Kong are talking about payment. Singapore is signing a lot of MOU around the world to see how we can do interoperability with other countries and so on. So not only interoperability with blockchain, but interoperability with IoT, with a lot of other things that we are talking about. So there are many standards, committee and people working on this, and there are many different standards organizations out there. But it would be good that organizations like UNDP or other international organizations start talking about interoperability, start talking about standards, then so that all the countries can come to understand that it will be the road travel will be less, so that we can shorten the learning curve, because we are crowdsourcing wisdom, we are crowdsourcing resources, and there is a reason why all this development is open source.
Yeah.
Because
I think I want to just conclude it in here. You've mentioned that international organizations have to create an awareness, and I think this is exactly one of the examples that we're trying to create awareness on the technology and its applicability for the international trade and supply chain management, including, of course, food traceability, probably most importantly, food traceability. And by concluding, I'll just like to mention again that it's so important, as Professor Lee mentioned, to really think about investing into the digital infrastructure, because if we go back into the history, probably 18th century, 19th century, one of the drivers of economic growth and development was physical infrastructure. Now it's time to think about digital infrastructure. So this is number one kind of activity that we need to do. Number two is also think about how we're going to regulate new intangible economy, because it's really getting more and more difficult to understand and in particular to measure the digital economy. And I think these instruments will help us also to regulate and to better arrange the system in general. And the third would be also to invest in the human capital. And because there is a growing demand for the different professions in the field, and if we're speaking about creating this digital infrastructure, then we need to have users of the digital infrastructure. So it's not only the human capital development, but it's also basic trainings for those people who needs to adapt to the new conditions in the economy. And the last thing is awareness raising. But of course, there are many more steps that we need to do. And very soon we're going to share a material with you that Professor Lee led that work in terms of the designing a simple document that explains what is blockchain technology and how it's applied in the food traceability. So we hope that it will become a guide for the governments, for the private sector operators who will be interested to investing and operating blockchain-backed systems, and in particular in the area of international trade. With this, we would like to conclude episode 2. Thank you for your attention.